Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick. Welcome to what we're now calling this the Wernick Files. So I'm happy to be speaking again with Robin.
Howdy.
Robin has been doing a lot of writing on what he has called cultural drift, uh, as almost everything Robin writes about. Always interested in what Robin writes about. So and like to discuss many of the things that Robin finds interesting, and this is a topic that I find interesting. And so, Robin, why don't we start off with uh, you defining what you mean about cultural drift?
Absolutely. So let's go to basics. Humans are different than the other animals on the planet. And our best summary explanation of what that difference is cultural evolution. Yeah, we have big brains, and that allows cultural evolution, but it's cultural evolution that's the key thing. That's what makes a difference. Cultural evolution is Darwinian evolution. So humans are subject to the Darwin story, but it's a little bit of a different story than ordinary DNA evolution. DNA evolution is really slow. Changes happen generation after generation when you inherit slightly different DNA from your parents, and you only have two parents in the DNA scenario. But in culture, you can have many parents who you inherit behaviors with from during your lifetime. And so the potential for very rapid evolution is much higher. And that's our main explanation for why humans have been doing so spectacularly well for the last hundreds of thousands of years here on the planet. That's our superpower, is culture. So it's an important power, and basically we've kind of messed it up. That's going to be the story, but I have to explain how we've messed it up. But did you want to stop and?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I was going to say something, but better that you just continue how we messed it up, and then
okay. So
I might object. Go ahead.
So first of all, culture is a natural selection process, and it has more than one level. So that may be the thing that's hardest for some people to swallow. Even DNA evolution has multiple levels. So with DNA, you have species, and you can talk separately of the evolution within species and the evolution of species. That is, in order to be a member of a species, you have to be able to mate with other members of the species, and that constrains many of your features. So the features that define a species, which are the features that you have to mate with another member of your species, evolution of that can't really happen much within the species. To get natural selection of that, you need to have multiple species, different species that do things different, and then there can be selection across those species. So that's two levels of evolution. And actually, it seems to turn out that the evolution of species matters more than the evolution in species, because when we look at where life came from today, it tends to come preferentially from fragmented habitats like coral reefs and forests, rainforests and rivers, where there are many species, each of which is small because the habitat is so fragmented. And they have more descendants today because they could support more evolution of species. Okay, so that's the first thing to say. Now, there's an analogous thing in culture, which is the evolution within cultures and the evolution of cultures. So think about corporations, because I know you're fond of that. We have evolution of corporate cultures, and there are many things that can involve within corporations. And the bigger a corporation is, the easier it is to take any one innovation from one part of the company and move it to another part. So a few big companies does better for evolution within corporate cultures, within corporations. But to get evolution of the corporate cultures, we need a lot of corporations. And so industries with more fragmented firms, i.e. smaller firms, actually do better overall innovation-wise, because even though they do worse on innovation within the corporate culture, they do better for innovation of the corporate culture because there are more different cultures that get tried. So again, in culture, there's these two levels, okay? Mm-hmm. So, you or others might well push back and say, no, I don't believe in this level, levels of evolution stuff. There's just one level, so this isn't a thing. So you could doubt me on that ground. But if you accept this idea there are multiple levels, then today we have macrocultures. So corporate cultures dictate what you do at work. They tell you how to work with your colleagues within a firm. And you might have a church culture, what happens in your church, or a club culture. But then we have a more basic background macroculture that tells us basic things about attitudes toward family, nation, patriotism, community, death, those sorts of more basic values. And those macrocultures have changed a lot over history, and they matter a lot for how we live our lives and what happens in our world. So that's the thing I worry about, is the cultural evolution of the macrocultures. So I'm almost finished.
Go ahead.
Okay. So now I want to make an analogy to, say, driving a car. The fundamental thing that natural selection has to do, I mean, we think of natural selection as improving things over time, which it does.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, the more basic task it has to do is to prevent things from getting worse. In the short run, it has to fix errors and keep us not going bad. So it's like driving a car. In the abstract, driving a car, you're thinking, where am I trying to go? When do I want to leave? How long will it take to get there? But in the short run, in driving a car, the thing you're trying to do is not drive off the road. You're trying to stay on the road and follow the road. So evolution needs to do a task like that. It has to stay on a road. So if you think about driving a car, there's a set of parameters of the process, which mean that if those parameters are in a good regime, it'll work well. So imagine you're on a road that's pretty straight, doesn't curve very much. You're going slow. It's a flat road. It's really bright. You can see clearly. You're going to be able to stay on the road. But now turn all those parameters to the worse. The road wiggles a lot. You're going really fast. It's dark. The road is bumpy. You don't have a good reaction time. Now you worry, I might not stay on the road because this control process is getting too hard for me given my parameters. Okay, cultural evolution is like that. It has a set of parameters that define it as a control process. So now cultural evolution, or natural selection in general, but cultural evolution of cultures, is, think of a high dimensional space. There's a big space of possibilities. And in that space, there's an adaptive region. That's the good space. It's a small fraction of the volume, but that's where you want to be. And that region will actually move. And the job of natural selection is to follow it, to not let it get out of the way, just like the job of driving a car is to make sure you stay in the middle of the road.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in this process, there's a set of points, a cloud of points. There's this adaptive region, and there's a number of parameters here. One parameter is how many points do I have?
Mm-hmm.
Another parameter is points in the region, they grow and split, and points out of this region shrink and die. And that's the strength of the selection pressure. In order for this cloud of points to track the region, what we need is for the points near the middle of the region to grow and the other points to go away. And that's how the cloud can track the region. So 2 parameters so far: how many points do we have, and how strong is this rate at which it grows inside and shrinks outside? But there's 2 other parameters too. One is, how fast does this region move? The faster it moves, the harder it's going to be to track. And fourth is, each of these points might just wiggle extra randomly, independent of all the rest of the stuff we've been talking about. And if it wiggles too much, they just might all wiggle away from the adaptive region and it'll end. So these are 4 key properties, parameters of the cultural evolution process. And if they're in one, end of the spectrum, it'll work well. The cloud will track the region as it moves, and cultures will stay adaptive. On the other hand, if the parameters go bad, then the cloud may fail to track the region, and then they'll become maladaptive and slowly fade and die. That's the thing I'm worried about here. And so finally, let me tell you about how these parameters have changed over the last 3 centuries. So 3 centuries ago, the world had hundreds of thousands of little peasant cultures, each of which had a few thousand people in it. All the people near a village, say. And each of those peasant cultures was near the edge of survival. It was vulnerable to famines and wars and pandemics. And therefore, it faced pretty strong selection pressures.
Mhm.
If some local, peasant culture decided to be weird about marriage or something, and that made it not work so well, then it would just die away and be replaced by neighboring cultures because they faced strong selection pressures. The world 3 centuries ago, say, was changing slowly. Like the world economy doubled roughly every 1,000 years. So what it needed to track in order to stay adaptive was changing slowly. And finally, these were conservative cultures. They weren't trying to change. They were trying not to change very fast, and they were trying to preserve the way they had been. So they were not wiggling very much on their own. That was the world of, say, 3 centuries ago, worldwide. Now, over the last 3 centuries, we've had enormous changes in the world, which we like many of course. First of all, if we look at the variety, there was this huge change from peasant cultures to nation states. So Peasants into Frenchmen is a famous book about how that happened in France, but it happened everywhere. Purposely, nations, the governments of regions, decided to create national cultures. They went out of their way to push a national language. They used national schools. They pushed national standards, integrated national economy. They created national cultures. And the French were a culture and the English had a culture. And that greatly reduced variety from hundreds of thousands down to, hundreds of national cultures. And then that was a century ago. That happened in France, say in the 1800s, and elsewhere in the world it's happened a little later. But now the world is full of national cultures. But over the last half century, even century, elites, at least in the world, have been merging into a global monoculture. That is, if when I meet promising young people around the world today, they all tell me the following 2 things. They say that the place they're from, say Brazil, has some unique, distinctive culture that the world should value. And they also tell me that they personally have no distinctive features that will bother you in putting them in any, global organization. They are all quite substitutable as members of a global elite. So that's a vast reduction in cultural variety of the basic aspects of culture. Secondly, we look at the selection pressure. That is, stuff in the region grows, stuff out of the region shrinks. In terms of these macro cultures, the world's gotten rich, peaceful, healthy. These macro cultures are just not dying off because of wars and famines and pandemics anymore. So the selection pressure is really weak. The main selection pressure might be fertility, actually, which happens over a longer time scale. But it's weaker than it used to be. So that's the selection pressure. That's the second parameter. Now we've only got 2 more parameters to go, and we're done with our story. The third parameter is the rate of change of the environment. So the world economy has been doubling roughly every 15 to 20 years for the last century or so, which is much faster than the 1,000 years before. So that means the adaptive region that you need to follow has been moving faster. If you want to have an adaptive culture, it needs to change faster if it's going to keep up with changes in the modern world. And then finally, in terms of how rapidly these things move, roughly around 1900, the modernist movement arose and cultural elites switched from trying to preserve old cultures to eagerly trying to find new ones and cause cultural change. And for the last century, many of our highest heroes have been cultural activists who've been seeking to cause cultural change in the directions they find attractive. And that's made these points move around of their own strongly in ways that aren't obviously connected to how close they are to the adaptive region in the space of cultures. So this is the end of my story. So to summarize, humanity has been using cultural evolution as its main superpower, but we haven't been noticing that. We've just been enjoying our improved cultures with this cultural evolution process. But it depended on these parameters that previously were working fine and would work fine for hundreds of thousands of years. And then in the last few centuries, we've allowed these parameters to drift away from where they would stay on the road and work reliably as a control process into the regime where it's plausible, although not obvious, that this natural selection process isn't maintaining the adaptiveness of these cultures anymore. They are drifting off the road into maladaptation, and therefore our culture is drifting off the road. So everything I've said is theory so far, right? I'm giving you some data, but it's about the parameters of the process. But you might say, Robin, is there any evidence that in fact our cultures are becoming maladaptive, or is this all abstract? And what I might suggest for the most concrete evidence that culture has in fact become maladaptive is falling fertility. If you look at, so we are a biological species. If you look at biological species out in the wild, having them fall in population when there isn't some great crisis that they have to deal with is really unusual. That's what's happening to humanity. We are rich and peaceful and healthy, and yet the number of babies peaked in 2016 worldwide. Plausibly, the world population will peak in another 3 decades, and we are on track for that to continue for several centuries. I don't think human extinction is on the table, thankfully, but that's just a pretty clear sign, I would say, of cultural maladaptation. We could walk through some other signs if you want, but you've indulged me all this time to just explain the problem. So I should stop now and let you push back or ask questions or whatever you want to do.
I'll make some comments and ask questions along the way while I'm making comments. You know, I think in politics, there's been talk now for, well, dating back to a lot of candidates. Patrick Buchanan in the 1980s. There's this discussion about culture wars in the country. So I think everybody talks about culture, that might mean something different by how they would define that word culture. So, but many people in the country think the biggest battle we face today is this culture war, and to some extent it could be reflected in go woke, go broke, and now they say one of the most successful, one of the many successes of the Trump administration is to basically put wokeism, in retreat. So you could say that maybe that is a quote culture war that for the time being has been we're outlawing mentioning diversity. Soon it might be a felony to even mention the word. So so we're also forcing a change in language, and that change in language, as things move in and out of our vocabulary, the presence of certain words and then the removal of certain words in and of themselves, that will change culture, as we stop, as certain words become taboo and other words become acceptable, then the way we communicate with each other, we're changing the codes and rules of engagement for how we communicate with each other, because 5 years ago, you would have said diversity and people would have said, hugged you and said, this is an enlightened person. Now you say diversity and you say, this is a wokist who should be broke, so it's the same word, but the same word has a very different meaning and a different reaction when other people listen to those words, because, our culture has changed. I wrote, on behalf of one of the we have two accounts, on more than two accounts really, on X. One is the Wernick Files account, and the other is a fine print. I write some of the entries on the fine print one, and today I wrote a piece, which is a speculative piece, obviously, on what if George Washington was president today, what would he say as how would he have addressed the nation differently than Trump did yesterday? So, and what would have he likely been appalled by? And at that point in time, not that Washington and Jefferson and Madison and Franklin were perfect individuals; they all were flawed. But when it came to public discourse and their desire for quote Republican virtue, they not likely would not say, I've reduced drug prices 500%, and 900%, and they might not have said it they would not have said it, not only not because they might have been morally superior people, it's because the culture of that time would have rejected those comments, and they would not have been taken seriously for holding public office, because saying that type of embellishment, if we read like Washington, and why Washington was the obvious choice for the commander in chief during the American Revolution, why he was the president of the Constitutional Convention, why basically when they were writing the Constitution, everybody in the room knew who the first president would be. It would be him. And why people went in the room, when he didn't want to serve a second term, went back and pled with him to serve a second term. I mean, there was something about his personality, and he from a young person, he had his diary about his virtuous behavior, how you behave in public and stuff like that. So he knew he was a role model, and everyone around him accepted him as a role model, not through the act of force, but through their own free will. They knew he set an example, that no other American set, and there was this broad consensus about that. And that's why, like, when he only ran for 2 terms, he set an example. So everybody else that followed him, until FDR, 2 terms and they were gone, not because there was a constitutional limit on it. It's because if George Washington thought I should only run 2 terms, I'm only going to run 2 terms. So, people didn't question it because you wanted to mimic, George Washington. So I don't know how much of this change in culture is linked to the fact for the first, up until 1913, we had no central bank, we had sound currency, we didn't have a regulatory state, we didn't have a nanny state, we didn't have a patriarchal or matriarchal government. Government spending was 3.5% of GDP. We didn't have a big standing army, so we were a country that, on the most part, minded our business throughout the world, and unless somebody poked us, we would not poke first, on the most part. So and people had no expectations, that government would do much for them. Then we had the Great Depression. So the question was, the Great Depression an event that actually became an inflection point in our culture because of an event? Maybe it was perceived in, like a black swan event, and did this black swan event, that people adapt to it by saying, this rugged individualism doesn't work. I need help from the government, even though the government exacerbated it through a whole bunch of policies that began with Hoover, of wage and price controls, and the government intervening in the marketplace in a way it had historically not done. And then we created all these regulatory bodies. And so now risks that used to be handled by us as individuals, now we've delegated most of our social insurance to government, where things that we used to do on our own, we defer to government to do it. And so, sometimes when I speak about culture, and what I think is the debasement of culture is when people have conversations, when they do, debase words because they're more interested in winning an argument that gives them status in a tribe, as opposed to like winning an argument because their logic and their reason is the most persuasive. So that doesn't seem to dominate our discourse anymore. And if I ask people, frequently, when I speak to people about, we're the first generation that is going to basically leave, a mountain of debt to future generations in a way previous generations had never done before. Can you tell me why you think that's moral? And I just get stares and blank expressions, and many people will insult me and call me an asshole or things like that, because I'm basically saying that they're immoral people. And the same thing I say, in 2033, more or less, the expectation is that Social Security, and most people don't understand it's a trust fund, but those that I explain it to, I say, well, it's a trust fund. It's been funded by everyone, and it only has recourse to its own funds. It doesn't have recourse to the Treasury. So in 2033, If they basically said the trust fund, can no longer pay you 100 cents on the dollar, it's only going to pay 70, 75 cents on the dollar. Are you going to go to the government and ask for that other 25 cents? Or are you going to adapt to the fact that this is what you funded, so don't expect more than you funded, and there is no promise that pays you full. There's only a promise to pay you what they can pay. There was the hope that they could pay you 100 cents on the dollar, but at the end of the day, to pay the 100 cents on the dollar, you had to fund it adequately, and you decided not to fund it adequately, and you've been told for almost your entire lifetime that you've not funded it adequately, yet you still determined to not fund it adequately. So what are you going to do? You're going to accept the underfunding, or you're going to complain, and you're going to expect that people who are working today, who were never part of this bargain, are not only going to have to figure out how they fund their own Social Security, their own retirement, they're also going to have to help fund your retirement. So when I place it, to me, these are cultural issues. They're moral issues, and they're not just economic issues. There should be what claim do we have against other people, and what claim do we have against other people that we can use force and without seeking people's consent? People's attitude towards that, 100 years ago, is very different than it is today. And so the government has altered our evolutionary path, of our culture by its intervention in the culture, like government intervention impacts everything it touches.
Culture co-evolves with many things, including governance. Mm-hmm. And 250 years ago, obviously, governance and culture of the United States was different from many other cultures and governance in the world. And then over that time, there have been changes in both governance and culture in the United States. And you like some of those changes probably, but not others. to summarize, at the highest level, that is, for many of the cultural changes you've seen, you go, why did we do that? That looks bad. But if I were to ask you, do you see any positive cultural changes over the last few centuries, you could probably come up with some ones you like. I don't know, but I'm guessing you would. So that the larger history here is both that the world has worked.
There are obviously certain positive cultural change. I mean, we ended slavery, right?
Okay, good. So right. There you
slavery
go.
was an institution that culturally was acceptable, at our founding, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. It was an accepted institution. So the cultural mores at that point in time, saw nothing wrong with slavery. I think our culture has evolved to the extent that we see all human beings,
there's two big trends
as articulated by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence.
Now,
include and then also 1919, where women got the right to vote. So the women were treated as with equal citizenship rights as anyone else.
Right.
And also a lot of the ending the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. That made sure that there were certain inalienable rights that would not only had to be protected by the federal government, by the states as well. I think there are positive things in culture on that have occurred in the last.
Right.
I mean, recently I don't see any good things on culture.
Okay. So first of all, let's just notice that the arguments for and against recent cultural changes are a very popular thing. That is, most keynote speakers and op-ed writers, etc., they're all pontificating on recent changes, what they like or don't like, anticipated future changes that they would like to have or would like to resist. The most prestigious people in our world are arguing often over cultural changes and which ones they think are good or bad. That's a key fact about our world, but almost all of that discussion is at the level of which cultural changes I and you might like. Very little of it is at the level of the system that I'm trying to point us to, how this whole system works and whether the whole system has a problem. And that's hard because that system level discussion is not very prestigious. And the people who do it, academics who specialize in cultural evolution, they are really eager to seem scientific, and they want to say, I'm just an observer describing this process, and they don't really want to get involved in recommending things because they feel that will detract from their prestige as a scientist in order to just describe this process. So analyzing this whole process and deciding some of that's good or bad is not very widely done. That's the key problem I'm trying to point us to, is to step outside of this process and see how the whole process has changed. So two key things that have happened over the last, say, 250 years of the time scale you're looking at. One is that much more of a merging of the world. Instead of these separate cultures, the US having its own separate culture and going its own way, the world is merged together. And many of these issues are worldwide issues now of culture, including how to do retirement and how much to regulate and tax and all those things that have become pretty worldwide issues.
How much, going back to the worldwide, maybe these worldwide, I think a lot of, to the extent that there's been some sort of convergence around culture,
Yes.
I think part of it is because, many people are freer now than they were, a long period than they were years ago. And I think, people don't like this word, but globalization
Right.
has done that, because basically the dominant culture,
It's a real thing,
between people of different cultures, is commerce. That they,
yes,
visitors come and go, and they hang out. They go to Disney World or
right,
go to Paris or go somewhere else. They'll stay there a couple of days, maybe speak to a couple of French people, or French people speak to a couple of Americans. But for the most part, vacationers don't really intermingle and have much impact on culture, unless there's a constant influx, like in Venice, where it's basically just a city of
tourists,
tourists. But so in the most part, but if you have, but commercial culture is people signing joint ventures. I mean, they're building a relationship. So it's the commercial culture is not really transactional. It's relationship oriented, and that relationship is defined within a legal context. And most of them have settled on what jurisdiction they're going to settle disputes in, and it's usually either the United States or the UK, but it's basically the dominant commercial culture, which might be changing a little bit with the BRICS, is basically, the common law system, the Anglo-American common law system is the dominant commercial culture.
So, compared to 3 centuries ago, if you read history about the world 3 centuries ago, you'll see that the world was really quite different in different places all around the world 3 centuries ago. And now we're much more similar. Even there is still differences, and we can talk about what those are, but those differences have been mainly reduced plausibly due to more talk, travel, and trade, as you say.
Yes.
We are more in contact with each other, more sharing things we buy and make for each other. And that's moved the world together. And that's created this more like a world monoculture than was 3 centuries ago. And that's a key trend that's happened over these 3 centuries. And the other key trend was that while, say, in the American Revolution, people were clearly willing to make a change. They made a change in their governance, right? That was a substantial change, but they saw that as a big exception. Mostly people in that century, 1700s and even 1800s, were thinking that technology was changing, world conditions were changing, but they were the same people with the same values and the same culture. And they saw themselves as trying to preserve and continue the culture they had inherited. And then sometime around 1900, the world changed to people being eager to cause cultural change. And since then, these culture wars, which have been going on at least since then, have become much more energetic and prestigious, because now most people expect culture to change and they are trying to push their direction of change, and change has happened a lot faster. So I asked ChatGPT the following task. I asked it to come up with 100 conflicts in the last 3 centuries, but more than 50 years ago, where the young and the old had a conflict about some aspect of culture. And I asked it to score then in the long run, which side won, the young or the old. And its score was 96 times the young won, once the old won, and 3 times it was a tie. That was its scoring of these cultural conflicts over these centuries. And the one time the old people won was that LSD hasn't become legal yet.
Mm-hmm.
So cultural movements have often been youth movements. Youth movements have been often the energy and driving force of cultural change. And they, once the youth get together into a big enough group that they decide they want something, apparently they just usually win in the long run. They can stick with it. They get their way. So we've had at least a century now of that sort of a rapid cultural change because of repeatedly having more youth movements who each pick new directions that they want to cause change. And that's where we are today. Many of us might like some of the changes, dislike others. But if we step back from the ones we personally like, we want to step back and think about this larger system. And this larger system is about adaptation. So that's a concept that people usually talk about when they talk about culture wars and which way we should win. Adaptation is this biological concept of a community and individuals having more descendants and not shrinking and going away. And natural selection is supposed to be selecting for adaptiveness, selecting for individuals and cultures that are more adaptive. And that's the thing we should worry isn't happening, that the cultural evolution process isn't making things adaptive. Things are definitely changing, and they're often changing into ways that individuals at the time like, at least some people, because they're the ones pushing for it, and then they get their change. But we can worry about whether, on average, they're pushing in adaptive directions. If they aren't, then that's just random wiggling of the points, as I talked about. They're not tracking the adaptive region. They're just wiggling a lot.
How much can you assert that that's also because of government intervention? I mean, in the sense of, if we had real free market capitalism, firms create, they go bankrupt. There's a procedure for what happens when firms bankrupt, and the only reason a firm that can't survive in the marketplace, if it can't raise capital, if it has no access to capital and has no cash flow, then the people have claims against the company
Right.
will determine, whether they want to take over the company or they want to liquidate the company. So there's a process. Then everybody who's participates in the capital structure understands the rules of the game and
Right.
where they rank in the hierarchy of claims, against the assets, of the company. And some people bargain well and might be able to extract rent from another class, so there might be, quote, some deviations from absolute priority rules. And some of the rules are designed to create those minor deviations. So, but in the political marketplaces, as I said, when you can roll over debt in the absence of a hard budget constraint, maybe in the absence of somewhat of a social Darwinian process, the question is, do you really get, the survival of the fittest? You might get a lot of inequality, so you might get the fittest might be, the wealthiest, but they're not the dominant influence in the culture. They're just ones with a lot of money that can influence rules so that they keep a lot of their money and they can keep a lot of other people poor. So they might be better at rent extraction, but that doesn't mean they control culture. It just means they're better at accumulating wealth and using government to tilt the playing field towards them. But they have less of an impact, on culture. So the question is
Right.
if we had a process that was, and I don't mean to advocate for that, I'm just making a statement that if we had
Right.
a social Darwinian process where the government didn't intervene, where the government didn't provide assistance to
Right.
farmers who had tough times, when you're unemployed, your savings had to do it. If you're not productive work, maybe you have to be homeless and maybe you'll die of starvation.
Right.
So if we had a process like that, with the outcome of what our culture looked like, if people didn't rely upon government, if they had to rely upon basically the philanthropy of
Right.
other individuals, how much would our culture look differently if that was the case?
So I started out telling you there were these two levels of cultural evolution.
Yeah.
There's things that are allowed to vary within a culture, and then there are things that have to sort of stay constant across a culture. Attitudes toward government and law are part of those things that are shared in a culture that then prevent as much local variation within the culture. in particular say you can only get so rich if the culture punishes people who get very rich and taxes them and does things to them. If the larger culture would just let there be more variation in wealth, then the local selection factors of wealth would be more powerful and have more influence on behavior. So one of the things that matters here is which behaviors are at what level. So in a society where the norms are government shouldn't do very much, then more things are subject to local variation and selection. But when the people decide that there's a collective issue and they want to make everybody do it the same, then it becomes a cultural issue. And now selection has to be of cultures to make that one work, because you can't win within the culture by having selection there. So I do think a long-term solution to our cultural drift problem would be to have more things taken out of the cultural level and allowed to vary individually. So literally more capitalism that is more areas of life that are controlled by capitalism, you would in fact have more variation and selection of those aspects of life, because capitalism has a lot of selection pressures. So for example, if we had for-profit orphanages that capitalists ran, well, they would probably make a lot of babies if they could sell them, because for-profit capitalists would figure out how to do that. But most people hate that idea, so they don't want that. If we had for-profit governments, for example, then government policy would be now driven more by capitalism, and then selection pressures would drive that, and then government choices would be more adaptive because they would be driven by a capitalist selection process. And so for the purpose of fixing cultural drift, yes, I'm happy to say it would be good to move more aspects of life out of the shared cultural level and into the let people do that differently at individual levels. But most people hate those ideas. And so, it's an obstacle. But yes, in principle, that's one direction of solution, is to increase selection pressures by making more things be allowed to be varied and still subject to selection, i.e. capitalism. But again, a lot of people hate that. And that's, as you know, one of the main changes over the last few centuries in culture has been that people have changed their minds about what are the appropriate scope for government and what are the appropriate scope of norms, and which things should people be allowed to vary individually, and which things should the community step in and take charge of or make sure goes the way they think it should go.
Yeah, which I think is a complete perversion of our founding culture.
Right, but now people are eager to change the old culture. So, once upon a time, the idea that that's the way we used to do things carried a lot more weight than it does now, because we're in this world where people are eager to cause cultural change, and they're looking out for the next big cause whereby cultural will change. And when you say this is what we used to have, that doesn't carry a lot of weight with people anymore.
Yes. But, there's a difference between the cultural change that's driven by individuals and their engagement with each other, as opposed to, forming a mob, using that mob to influence
Yes,
government, and then coercing that change onto other people. So basically the change is not voluntary, but coercive in nature. So it seems
right.
It seems to me
but that was a culture.
it seems to me we have a culture now where people think that their culture should be the dominant culture, and because they think it's the best culture,
yes,
that they think they should impose it on everyone. Now, is that not, whenever I say this, whenever I use this analogy, people get very upset, but I don't think they should. Okay, so and I'll say why. Okay. To me, those people are no different than Nazis. It doesn't mean they'll use the same tools. It doesn't mean they're prepared to create concentration camps, but it's essentially the same dogma. My culture is the best culture. It's a superior culture. It should be the governing culture, and other people who are not are inferior cultures. So
let's talk about,
as I said, the methodology to assert their culture is different than the methodology the Nazis used. But that doesn't mean the mentality is any different. It's just to what extent the boundaries you set on the tools. But even now, I mean, look, we're right now, we might go out, we might kill a whole bunch of people in Venezuela, over what most people don't even know what we're fighting over. Some believe that Maduro is the biggest drug seller of in the United States. They don't know that's not true because they don't read, they don't inform themselves, or they think he's shipped over Tren de Aragua here to overthrow the country and overthrow the government. I think you got to be really, really dumb to really believe that, but apparently there's a large element of people who are just really dumb. So, but if you and so you have the government basically creating this devil, and this is something also the founders warned us of. Avoid a demagogue that sells this type of bullshit. I mean, everyone who, if we got a decent education, everybody would have read the fact that everyone who fought our revolution said, "Gee, if you start seeing these signs, you failed." Okay, as a people who basically your objective function was to preserve justice and liberty, not to rule over other people and not to make your preferences universal preferences and to be coerced at your discretion. You just live and let live. Was more this. So
Herodotus, a long time ago, Herodotus said that everybody in their culture think their culture is best, and that they all think other people should follow their culture. So for many thousands of years, we've lived in a world where people with different cultures just live separately from each other and each ran their own little world. And then they often did try to conquer neighbors and make other people follow their culture. Then we've had liberalism arise. To some extent, the Roman Empire was liberal in the sense that for particular dimensions of culture, including religion, they said, we don't have a position on that. Right. And you can be Roman without having to follow some Roman position on many important cultural topics.
Right.
And then in the last few centuries, that's become a theme in the West. We have often tried to make liberal cultures, by which we meant that some aspects of culture were allowed to vary within a shared governance unit. We can live peacefully among each other and differ in our cultures in some ways. But then it's always been ambiguous, well, which are the ways we're allowed to differ? And whenever enough people got together and said, well, we shouldn't differ on this thing, then that thing went away as a thing we were allowed to differ. So there's a Harvard law professor who wrote a book just before he died around 2000 about the history of law in the United States. And his story was that initially, each jurisdiction had enormous discretion to just have different law, and that the center of law did not actually have much power to overrule local law.
Right.
But then through a sequence of moral crusades, each crusade was of the form, well, you can't let people vary in that. Surely we all have to agree on that. And slowly over time, we are forced to agree on more things nationwide because the Supreme Court has ruled that there are some things that you're not allowed to vary on because those were so important. So things like prostitution, drugs, slavery, alcohol, there were a number of just big moral crusades. And then the Supreme Court ruled, okay, yeah, everybody has to have the same ruling on alcohol or prostitution or slavery because that's a central moral issue. And you can see then the thing we share has slowly grown, at least in the United States.
There used to be, if we shared something, there used to be a requirement that once we acknowledged that we shared it, we would explicitly consent to it through a constitutional amendment, right? I mean, we had the amendments that ended slavery.
That's not how these legal rulings went.
Okay, that's how it worked for most of our history. Okay. Now,
he says the Supreme Court just made rulings that said everybody had the same ruling on prostitution, and they didn't have a constitutional amendment to support that. The Supreme Court just continued to make rulings saying, no, you're not allowed to deviate on that.
Yes, that's just judicial fiat.
Yes, and that happened consistently over centuries in the United States.
That's just judicial fiat. But so I mean, the point of it is that a lot of things that a lot of these major, the women's rights movement, that was not done by some judge saying, "I'm good tomorrow, women can vote." That was a constitutional amendment.
So some of them, yes, have had
Slavery was
constitution,
not
but
ended.
others have not.
The judge said slavery is over. Slavery was ended, and
Right.
the states were obligated to follow to respect inalienable rights, independent of whatever their state constitution was. That was the 14th Amendment. I mean, so a lot of these great, we had prohibition, and then we repealed prohibition. So all these were done.
Some of them were done through
by not lobbying 9 people and getting them to rewrite laws we don't like. There was understanding the rules of engagement were, that we had to accomplish this through broad consent of the people. And now there's no need. Now people don't feel the need to get the broad consent of the people to affect change.
Part of what's happened is, again, the world has come to share these norms. So the world, in fact, now shares some substantial, what they call multiculturalism norms, where not just in the United States, but many people around the world feel like they want to promote variation on some dimensions of culture, and they want to preserve that and even celebrate it. But on other dimensions, they think we all must toe the line and be the same. But what's happened is that the kinds of variations that we're willing to celebrate and even encourage have become more and more shallow. That is, people today, when they say multicultural, what they mean is different dress and hairstyles and songs and holidays and food and maybe even furniture. And people love to celebrate and even promote variations in those dimensions of culture. But if you talk about gender equality or democracy or death or medical experiments or other sorts of cultural issues, people hate the idea of variation on those and they suppress them. So, for example, if you look at COVID, worldwide, as soon as COVID came up, world elites all around talked about what to do. They all decided together what to do. And then they all forced the whole world to do the same thing. And they said, look, no, medical ethics is not one of those things we're allowed to vary on. We must all agree about how to deal with the pandemic. And then they did pretty much everywhere do it the same. And similarly, most areas of regulation worldwide are convergent, say nuclear power or airlines or banking. The world has pretty strong convergent regulations because people have decided, well, you shouldn't be allowed to vary on that. So, for example, organs.
How much of that is what people have decided, or how much of that is what Stigler wrote about, which is regulatory capture. So
whatever caused it.
That the winners are very good at capturing regulatory bodies to deter entry. So this is just all a part of
sure. I mean, there are many ways that culture gets caused, but once the changes get embodied in culture, then there they are, and they have a cultural momentum and inertia that makes things harder to change. So culture has many impacts, but like over the last century, again, people who try to change culture have become some of our greatest heroes socially. And then many people have been seeking how to change culture, and then changing culture through law or through the arts or through governance has been an aspiration of many people. They have gone into those particular areas of life exactly because they are part of a community that is seeking to change culture in particular directions. And that's been a big part of the history of the last century, is the net change. But my key observation would be these desires to change culture just aren't very correlated with what's adaptive. So from the point of view of cultural evolution, this is part of drift. This is not making things better. This is making things drift away from what was adaptive. But what was adaptive isn't the same as what you like or what you would enjoy. I have to admit, natural selection doesn't care how much fun you have, exactly.
Right.
And so there definitely can be a disconnect between what you think you would enjoy as a cultural change and what would be adaptive. And there's also a separation between what changes just happen out of selection and what changes happen through reason. So several times along the line, you've talked about how, you have arguments for the things you think and other people don't have good arguments on the other side. And one of the things that happened in the last few centuries is that we tried to use reason more as a basis for these many changes. So 3 centuries ago, people just inherited their culture and they didn't think much about justifying a culture.
Yes.
They had grown up in a culture and it seemed to be the right culture because they had always had it that way. And then we did introduce more of a norm of allowing people to challenge cultural elements on the basis of giving reasons for and against cultural things. And that's been a thing that's been happening for the last few centuries. But honestly, I don't think it's been the main driver of cultural change. It's been a rationale. There's people are more often giving excuses and rationales for changes that they like than actually changing them because of reasons, at least at this shared cultural level. Now, if we go down to the within cultural level about technology and business practices, I think a lot of technology and business practices have been driven by reason, figuring out which things were better and more effective. And when we have fewer macrocultures, we have better evolution within them of the things you're allowed to vary within them. So I think we should just notice that we have still great evolution of technology and business practices, much better than most of history ever had, because we do allow more changes there, and we have a lot of selection pressure there. That is, you make a better business and you do win and you do grow, and the world does promote and reward better businesses compared to others. And that's been a way the world has been improving culturally, is by allowing better technology and big business practices. But
yeah, I would say to the extent that more of the world embraces some form of capitalism, and has moved away from a form of collectivism, whether it's socialism or communism or the hybrids. I view that as all positive developments for culture, and to the extent that you say, we are now experiencing more prosperity and more peace. I would assert that it's because of things that what the book that first attracted me to go to University of Chicago, Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. Capitalism and freedom. So it's the linkage of those two. Might be the process that creates the greatest happiness and the greatest prosperity. And if more people have been exposed to it, they like the additional prosperity, and they like. And they like to have, every time when I hear people, who like to make a point of saying China is not a communist country, and the people there are probably more entrepreneurial than Americans are, and the individuals practice more free market capitalism because they're less likely to be able to corrupt the government official and get a favorable regulation, in order to give them an edge or deter entry, versus somebody else there. Theirs is a very intense, competitive capitalism, and more brutal than what we see in the United States. And that's become, after the periods of time where they had nothing, and then they found, wealth, and they liked being able to see the world and get to know other cultures and buy luxury items. They like their life better that way. And a lot of people, when they have gotten exposed to having the ability of actually creating wealth for themselves, find that they're happier creating wealth for themselves, than having their lives predetermined, for them. So I think it's that has created, the outcome that you have talked about, the greater peace. Why do we want to go to war with people we trade with? So who are we going against war? We go to war with countries we sanction. We're not going to war with countries we trade with. We go to war with countries we don't trade with.
Right.
So
the key thing is that in the areas of life that capitalism is allowed to rule and run wild, those areas don't seem to be culturally decaying or having maladaptation. That is, they seem to be selecting for more effective, efficient, et cetera, processes consistently over time. Growth and wealth is being produced in those areas of life. But there are many areas of life where our culture says capitalism shouldn't run those, and it doesn't allow capitalism to run those. And even intermediate areas where culture says, well, capitalism shouldn't run free there. It should be heavily regulated and limited, like education or medicine. And in the areas where capitalism just isn't allowed to rule, like, say, orphanages or fertility, then we can have big cultural problems. And also in the areas where capitalism is greatly restricted or limited because our culture says it can't be trusted there. And that is a lot of cultural decay or drift is happening, I think, in the areas that are very heavily regulated, like, say, again, medicine or education. And that's because our culture has those attitudes about it. And now you could say, well, they should change their mind. But if we step outside the process and say, but how are they changing their mind? What is the process by which people change their minds about these things? We could say, well, that's cultural evolution. And we can study that process and say, well, it's not obviously going to go in your direction.
How much cultural evolution, though, is shaped by, again, government and government propaganda? So,
But
I mean, government controls the people. When people go to public education, so the school education they get is defined by government, and the government has more access to the media. You know, the people in the media channels require government license to operate. So the extent is that government has, you know, significant influence about shaping ideas and what we think.
Everybody, including, say, Trump lately, who wants culture to change, they all look at government and go, if I had some power over government, I could push my cultural changes much more quickly and easily. And people have noticed that for at least a century. So people eager to change culture have typically tried to recruit government in the favor of their cultural change initiatives. So yes, many cultural changes have been caused via the intermediary of government helping people promote cultural changes, but in part that's because people wanted to cause cultural changes.
Part of how they accomplish it is instilling fear in people.
Of course, people use all the weapons they have. They use shame, they use insults, they use ridicule, they use prestige. People use every weapon they have in order to recruit powers to help push the cultural changes they want. But again, in the last century, that's become legitimized. It might have maybe seemed shameful to try to change culture using these powers, but now we say, well, the ultimate goal is to change culture. You are a good person if you are part of the vanguard of causing culture change, and then you are justified in using most any method, even murder, often to push for the cultural changes you wanted. That's been part of the change of culture in the last century or so, is the elevation of cultural change as a primary goal, as a celebrated hero. We are not eager to keep culture the same. We expect it to continue to change, and we expect to celebrate the people who tried to change it and won. And that's part of what the cause of cultural drift. Again, that's one of these 4 parameters, the last one, but it's actually not even the biggest one. These other 3 parameters are actually even bigger causes of cultural drift. Well, and if you look at them together, we say we're in deep trouble. This whole process is just not going to stay on the road. Humanity is in deep trouble here. And even recommending, you know, limited government, I don't see as sufficient to get the car back on the road.
Well, if the car's going to go off the road, I'd rather be the one driving the car that drives it off the road, rather than having somebody else drive it for me and me be a victim of their driving skills, rather than my own driving skills or lack of them. So
let's talk about what might happen if this fails. So my metaphor is you're on a ship heading to an iceberg. You have 2 options. You get into the control room and you turn the wheel to turn the whole ship. You have to fight over all the other people who want to control the wheel, to turn the wheel their directions, or you get off on lifeboats. That is, over the coming centuries, our dominant world civilization will probably just be shrinking, population declining, economy declining, innovation rates becoming much slower. And over centuries, there will be these alternatives that will be rising, plausibly to replace us, because groups like the Amish and the Haredim have been actually doubling in less than 20 years for over a century. And if they could just continue that for another couple of centuries, they can come to dominate the world. This is how the Christians took over the Roman Empire long ago. They just doubled every 20 years for 3 centuries. That's all it took. It's really hard.
And we might see the same here. Even though we're really a constitutional republic, most people's vocabulary is we're a democracy, and they use that term. You know, even though, which just again shows generally their ignorance of our founding documents, and our founding structure, where it was well thought through. and it's it's not a democratic structure. So by intention,
Well,
they all distrusted, the mob. They thought that democracy is mob rule, and they wanted to prevent the mob from being able to exert
right,
tyranny.
but
People,
again, the original founders' intentions and ideas aren't that persuasive to most people today. They don't feel very compelled to be held to be aligned with that.
yes,
They have their own new ideas about democracy and what versions of it they think are good, and that's what they're going to pursue today.
yeah. The problem I have, that logic I can accept, but I can only accept it up to a point. We have a governing document that people, our generation, Jefferson made the argument that no generation had the right to bind another generation. So he wanted, even though he had conversations with Madison, and Madison might have successfully persuaded him to drop that idea that we should have a new constitution. The life of the constitution would be 19 years, so every generation got to write its own constitution. So they got to write the rules that they would govern them. But what we've decided upon is that we have an existing constitution, and as a society, if we don't like it, we've agreed to a certain way of changing it, which is through the consent of an amendment process. So I might can understand people saying, I don't like the Constitution, but I'd say you might not like it, but then get a whole bunch of other people to consent.
But you know that in fact, the way we've changed it is just by reinterpreting the words in the Constitution. The courts have in fact consistently been changing the Constitution by reinterpreting it.
And they basically made it a blank piece of paper for them to rewrite it there at their discretion.
And that is our status quo world we're living in now.
Yeah.
And you could try to advocate for returning, but
that's illegitimate. That's that's basically a breach of contract. So unfortunately, it's a breach of contract that you have limited recourse to, but it's a breach of contract. Okay. So, but it is, but it is a breach. I would hope that we were moral people, which we are clearly not. Because if we were moral people, we would follow the rules. We would sit back and say, yes, we understand the Constitution was written, 250 years ago, but we also, but we also accepted the fact that we would have to update it. We'd update it through the amendment process. That was the only way of doing it. We didn't update it through elections. We didn't update it through influencing who sits on the court. There's only one legitimate way of updating it, which is unless we want to have another convention and we want to rewrite the whole document. So
you are arguing for a conception of legitimacy. Other people clearly disagree. They see other mechanisms as legitimate. There might be a sense in which you are in fact right, but culture doesn't care who's right. The cultural evolution process just cares who does what over time, who copies who in what ways. And here we are in a world where people have chosen another path.
Then culture just cares about who wins. So then, under that scenario, I mean, I don't want to make this about Trump. Trump can run for a third term and become president, and the Supreme Court could say, yeah, we don't care what the Constitution says. It's a blank piece of paper.
Right.
So we have this we have this mandate, and we didn't anticipate that the people would want this mandate. He's a savior. We have to have different rules for a savior. The founders didn't think about it, but it's implied somewhere that if a savior comes along, the savior could have multiple terms. It's somewhere implied somewhere else. And Alito could write that. And Gorsuch might sign on, and Roberts might sign on, and Clarence Thomas might say, yeah, I'm in on that as well. Kavanaugh says, it sounds good, and then people will say, well, that's what the Constitution says.
So that before the U.S. Constitution
doesn't say it, but the judges said it's what it says.
Okay,
it's implied there somewhere. You just don't have the same powers of reading between the lines that they have.
In 1700, the English courts, if they were responding to your arguments, they might rule differently than U.S. courts might have in 1800 on the basis of the U.S. Constitution. So you want us to be conservative up to a point. You want to hearken us back to the U.S. Constitution, but not to prior legal regimes. And that makes you a conservative at a certain level. That is, you don't want to go all the way back to Justinian legal code or something in the ancient Rome. You want to go back to the U.S. Constitution. And I might even like that, but I'm just trying to notice that.
I go back to the Articles of Confederation.
Okay, fine. But still, you don't want to go back 100 or 200 years before that. Exactly.
But the point of it is, I'm accepting the rules. I mean, I believe more like Jefferson had to believe, and Lysander Spooner.
Right.
I mean, I ultimately believe that, given the fact that I never consented to it, I should not be bound by it. And I think anything that
Right. But you didn't consent to the U.S. Revolution either, so maybe we should just go back to English law and treat the U.S. as still being ruled by England, because who consented to that anyway?
I consent to the fact that the philosophy that I have inalienable rights and that nobody can take them from me.
But,
and
that wasn't English law of 1600. You know that the courts didn't rule that way in 1600 in England, right?
As a human being, I don't need any document. I think I don't think anyone was born with a claim over anyone else. So I don't think anyone has a right to create a coercive claim over anyone else.
I don't want to disagree with you. I want to describe you.
I don't think anyone agrees that anybody else has a coercive claim. I mean, this is the perversion to me again of culture. If you ask somebody, does anyone have a right to have a coercive claim over you? People would say no. But then people are very happy having coercive claims,
right,
over everyone else. I think Lysander Spooner, summarized it well when he talked about the Constitution of no authority,
right,
and how he related the government to being even worse than a highwayman. So so I mean that's my personal belief, not as an American, just as a human being, not not being a male, not being Jewish, not being American, not being white. That's all irrelevant. Right. As a human being, I think me and anyone else, that what we are not born with claims against other people, and no one's born with claims
right,
against us. That's a state of nature.
Okay.
And any other claim after that, to me, is an illegitimate claim.
You are here
unless I consent.
You are being a cultural warrior. You are saying the culture of the founding United States Constitution and its attitudes toward law and commerce, that's the culture you embrace and want to support. And you want to resist cultural changes that have occurred since then that have pulled away from there. I don't want to agree or disagree with you so much as point out how that looks from the larger level of cultural evolution.
Yes.
Where does that sit in this larger process that's been happening all through human history that continues now? All through the last few centuries, we've often had people pushing for cultural change, and then people they called conservative said, you shouldn't change that. You don't know what you're doing. This old thing had a lot of value to it, and you're just trying to make a change on some pretty shallow grounds here that you don't understand. You guys should stop changing stuff too much. And I think on average, they were right. In fact, people were changing stuff too easily, too fast. That's what's caused cultural drift. But now that we drifted all this distance away from where we were, doing what conservatives say now doesn't necessarily fix things. That's a key problem. Culture is this big, complicated, integrated mixture of all these aspects of our attitudes toward life. And it's not really feasible to imagine just going back to 1800 culture in the United States as a whole package, because you don't like women's rights aspect, you don't like slavery. So somehow you have to do some sort of editing of the old culture to generalize it from its previous version to become something you like. And you can then pitch that to the world and say, hey, everybody, I think we should move this way. But the whole world is fighting over which ways to move. And I'm pointing out to you all, the whole process here is going wrong. This cultural war is just going wrong. You're all drifting off the road because you're not picking out adaptation as the guide star for your changes. You're picking out other moral axes as the thing that compel you to want to go different directions. And that's what's causing humanity's culture to break. Is at this larger level, we're going off the road. And people don't care very much because they're all fighting over the cultural directions they care the most about.
I think what the empirical data would seem to indicate that if we're fighting over this like macro culture, the macro culture that has created more prosperity and peace has been capitalism, as free market capitalism as possible, and
Right.
and I think there's strong, there's all these indices of economic freedom index, and ultimately the societies that seem to be the happiest and most prosperous are ones that are freest from economic freedom and also have good rule of law. I mean, we kind of know the framework we need to have to create prosperity and peace for as many people as possible, even though the trade-off will be there might be inequality that certain people find unacceptable.
And we've had very articulate people argue for that position with good evidence and good logic for several centuries, and they've been losing in the cultural fight against people pushing culture in other directions. Maybe they shouldn't have lost. Maybe it's an unfair fight. Maybe the audience is an idiot because they can't see wisdom, but the world has been moving in lots of other directions since then. And that's the fact of the world now. The world is drifting culturally in all sorts of directions, many of which seem maladaptive, including especially, say, fertility decline, but also excess regulation, I would say, is an example of that.
I think the rules of the game are, I think the rules of the game are established so that the people that win economically lose the culture war, but they win the economic war. Well, why do I say that? I say that because the fact is that throughout the world, we have most governments, many taxpayers don't have any real skin in the game because they're not paying taxes.
Right.
So whatever the government spends, they're not asked to sacrifice anything. They're a net beneficiary. They're not paying for anything. So it's all a positive sum game for them, since they're not contributing anything to the process. The other people who are paying for this basically have a deal. The government will say, I'm going to take money out of your pocket, I'm going to transfer it to other people, but I'll use the regulatory state to create more wealth for you. So I'm ultimately giving you more money than I'm taking from you.
That's the claim. And you and I might doubt that, but the cultural fact is they've won.
So that's a game that's created some sort of reasonably stable equilibrium. We'll see how long it's stable, because in order to keep up the bargain, all these countries have had to run deficits that are probably not sustainable. Right. So the question is what happens, when the markets will no longer finance this? What will happen to society, and what will be the culture that emerges, from the fact that all these promises that were made, there's just not the balance sheet to keep these promises.
So I think I can describe what you like as a kind of liberalism. And the world has moved toward liberalism over the last few centuries, primarily because the first countries that were getting rich and powerful, like, say, England, were relatively liberal and innovative. And the rest of the world said, oh,
classical liberalism we're talking about.
Sure. And we will need to be more open to innovation and more open to different cultural variety in our community so that we can win like England did, and then like Europe did. And that's been a major driver of openness, innovation, and that kind of liberalism for the last few centuries. The world now is overall more liberal in that way than most of the world was, say, 3 centuries ago. And innovation, I think, is a driver of that. That is because the more open, innovative, liberal cultures were actually innovative and then got richer and more militarily powerful. Other nations said, we got to do that too, or we're going to be conquered or fall behind.
Right.
If population falls, then innovation rates will also fall, and that will end. It will no longer be a threat that if you are not open and liberal, you won't innovate, because innovation will no longer really be a thing, and therefore not being innovative won't be much of a threat. So one of the things that will happen over the coming centuries is that, again, innovation will just be much, much slower. And so cultures and societies won't feel they need to do the sorts of things it takes to be innovative. And that will also threaten the kind of liberalism that you like worldwide, not just in the United States.
What do you think about the premise of the fact that it's a belief I have that that for most of the illegal immigrants that come into the United States, I think are additive to society, because I think there's going back to innovation. That I think people don't appreciate what they need to do to get into the United States requires a lot of innovation.
Sure.
people don't
Sure.
have.
We certainly,
So
innovation will select for people with a lot of initiative and willingness to take risks and willingness to suffer changes and even willingness to assimilate into a new culture. Innovation selects for those features of people, certainly. The main criticism I've heard about innovation is the culture they bring with them. And that if you thought you had a special, unique culture and you mix it in with people who come from other cultures, you will slowly dilute that culture. Now, in the past, we've often had high rates of assimilation where people were eager to become members of the new culture and to drop their old culture and adopt to the new culture. But some have claimed that that's happening less now, that we are more encouraging people to retain their own culture as opposed to assimilate to the new one. I don't know what the truth of that is, but that is a way to talk about their concerns.
Yeah, but when I hear those concerns, but when I hear about those concerns, I say, can you explain to me what culture you're referring to? So, I mean, the only culture that has a coercive aspect to it for me is government. I mean,
right.
So,
well,
so
for example,
the question is, are many of these people changing government in a way that they're coercing?
Yes. My understanding is that in the 1910s and 1900s, aughts and tens, we had a lot of immigration to the US, even through the 20s. And that it's been shown that those immigrants who came from places with more open to redistribution, that causally influenced the burst of redistribution in the United States in the 30s. The cultural imports of people who were more open to immigration, redistribution, then did help make the US become more open to redistribution. That's one of the events you talked about, saying, why did that happen? And that was one of the causes of that event.
I don't know.
I'm not sure how strong a cause.
I don't know if that was the cause or the depression was the cause. I don't know.
Well, they both contributed. I don't know which strength.
That women tend to support more paternalistic or maternalistic government.
Yes, giving women the vote also plausibly influenced. Yes. Also,
so the question is, there might be several factors, but
yes,
the people that hate immigrants decide to give priority to that one.
Sure.
Because they might just be cherry picking data. So it might be a cause. The question is, was it a dominant cause, as opposed to, a secondary or tertiary cause, and if your bias is, I hate immigrants, you're going to take, because they look differently, then they,
right.
They pray to a different God, that the bias will be that you'll take any piece of data and you'll cherry pick information.
But again, but Jeffrey, you are attracted to doing the cultural war here. You want to argue for your side of the cultural changes. I don't oppose it, but I just want to call attention to how this war is happening in a larger context of cultural evolution, where this kind of war is just going bad. Whichever side wins, the whole thing doesn't work in the long run. We are failing to support a healthy cultural evolution environment because we lost variety, we lost selection pressures, we have a much faster rate of context change, and we are too eager to cause changes. And that is the key problem of cultural drift. And we haven't talked much about solutions. We mentioned at one point that, yes, more capitalism would plausibly help, but the question is how much? Because we've really gone a long way causing a big problem. And so apparently we're going to need a big fix to be enough to overcome the problem.
I think capitalism is a necessary but not sufficient condition to solving the problem.
Because, for example, for fertility, we don't have capitalism running fertility. Fertility is mostly run by individual families, not capitalist units, who are doing it for other reasons. And those other reasons have been changed by culture, and that's what's plausibly made.
Well, there might be several reasons to change it. One might be the fact that you have, both parents working now when
we have many, but
and the part of it is to preserve a lifestyle that people feel they're entitled to get accustomed to. They have to go into a lot of debt, and so
the proximate causes of fertility decline seem to be cultural, and that's what firstly got me on this topic. I first was looking at fertility decline, saying we've got a problem here. What the hell? And then I tried to look in the details. I said, "Oh, it's cultural trends who are causing the fertility decline. Why is culture going wrong?"
How much is it economic? How much is it people just don't have the savings to afford any more, kids that they want?
And there might be other people.
just like people, the utility people might get from being a parent might also not be,
But
what it
that's
used to be.
cultural. Culture causes changes in the value people get from being parents because it changes the status that you get from being a parent. That's changed a lot, and that's one of the causes of fertility decline. So cultural decay, cultural drift has plausibly been a big contributor to fertility decline. And that's, again, a sign that culture has been going bad. And it doesn't say exactly how to fix it, unfortunately.
Yeah, but maybe if we had more capitalism, we had no taxes, people would save more money.
You're happy. You've got my vote, but my vote won't get you very far.
They might want to then have bigger families again, because they don't have to worry about. And
I actually think we could just
they'd have sound money. So if people didn't have to worry about paying, the type percentage of their income they have in payment, having the government intervene that makes everything more expensive, and then having unsound money that increases the cost of borrowing and inflation. If we didn't have any of those things that the government creates, maybe people would have more kids and fertility rates would be significantly higher.
I think we could actually more directly just pay parents to have kids. We could do that in a cost-effective way. That is, government borrows and then taxes people later to do that. And you could just pay parents a percentage of the tax revenue their kids are going to give later. And that would actually go a long way to encouraging it. But it's culture, I think, that blocks that solution. People culturally don't like the idea of paying parents. But if they'd be willing to, I think it would go a long way to addressing the problem if people would be willing to pay large enough amounts. But unfortunately, again, culture. So I think we're nearing the end of our original time allocation.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Sorry. Yes, I was enjoying the conversation. So we had an hour and a half.
And I've been enjoying it too. Obviously, we didn't solve it, but maybe we made this problem more visible.
How do you want to conclude in the last 3 minutes we have? They're all yours. So go ahead, Robin.
Well, I just want to mention that I've been thinking about this problem for a couple of years now and trying to outline different solutions. And the highest level thing to say is none of them look very attractive or likely. That is, this looks like we're in deep trouble. We have a serious problem, and I don't see easy ways to fix it. But governance is a solution direction that I'm interested in that if we could hand this problem to government, and it was competent, then yeah, they could fix it. But we haven't had competent forms of government for a while. But I've been working on this new form of government I've called futarchy or decision markets that you contributed to before I even started on this in working with governance in a firm using these concepts. And so I have some hopes that if we could develop a more competent form of government and show that it works on small scales, then we could trust it on larger scales. And then we might be able to use it to solve big problems like cultural drift. But that you can see is a long shot. Given that Jeffrey and we are pretty skeptical about government at the moment and have been for a while. Most of the things we've given government to do it doesn't do a very good job of. So we'd have to have a much more competent form of government before we would start to trust it with more bigger problems. That just shows you how deep. If that's my best solution, that's got to tell you just how desperate I am here, how bad a situation we're in. That would be how I'd want to finish up, is just say, there's a problem here, and I don't see an easy solution, unfortunately.
Would you trust government more if everyone was required to have skin in the game, and everyone would be required to have the same amount of skin in the game, so that we didn't have a progressive tax, but that whatever government did, every individual would have to contribute equally as an individual, since you assume they would get the same the benefits should be evenly distributed, so they should be evenly paid for. So if that's the case, would you feel that the government would likely would you think there'd be more wisdom in government if that was the circumstance?
I mean, all else equal, that sounds like a good direction, but the fundamental problem is just very complicated. So in a complicated design space, you just more want to look for possible solutions and try them out. You don't want to trust your overall intuitions about directions very well. That doesn't work very well for general design. It helps you maybe think about which directions to try, but fundamentally you want to try things and see how they work. So that's where I am, is like, I'm open to lots of things, but let's try them. Okay. Let's make sure they work.
Well, let those be the last words then.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, Robin.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.